A very good evening, everyone. Tonight we will be continuing Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. I've been away for a while. I had stuff to do with uni and was also very hot in the Netherlands, so I didn't really feel like reading. However, we're gonna start again. I have forgotten the voices, so whereas in the previous episode you might have heard me do voices for certain characters, I will be refraining from doing that from now on, seeing as I don't think I will be able to keep it consistent, and if I'm not able to keep it consistent, I don't think it would actually add anything to the storytelling experience. So, yes, if you, unlike the H.P. Lovecraft streams, if you haven't seen the previous part, I would encourage you to go listen to that first, seeing as I will be continuing onwards from chapter 4 and probably going until 6 or maybe 7, depending on how my throat feels after that. So yeah, let's get into it. The lift was crowded with men from the Alpha changing rooms, and Lenina's entry was greeted by many friendly nods and smiles. She was a popular girl, and, at one time or another, had spent the night with almost all of them. They were dear boys, she thought, as she returned their salutations. Charming boys. Still, she did wish that George Edsell's ears weren't quite so big. Perhaps he'd been given just a spot too much parathyroid at meter 328. And looking at Benito Hoover, she couldn't help remembering that he was really too hairy when he took his clothes off. Turning with eyes a little saddened by the recollection of Benito's curly blackness, she saw in a corner the small, thin body, the melancholy face of Bernard Marks. "Bernard!" She stepped up to him. "I was looking for you." Her voice rang clear above the hum of the mounting lift. The others looked round curiously. "I wanted to talk to you about our New Mexico plan." Out of the tail of her eye, she could see Benito Hoover gasping with astonishment. The gape annoyed her. Surprised I shouldn't be begging to go with him again, she said to herself. Then aloud, and more warmly than ever, "I'd simply love to come with you for a week in July," she went on. Anyhow, she was publicly proving her unfaithfulness to Henry. Fanny ought to be pleased, even though it was Bernard. "That is," Lenina gave him her most delicious significant smile, "if you still want to have me." Bernard's pale face flushed. What on earth for? She wondered, astonished, but at the same time touched by the strange tribute to her power. Hadn't we better talk about it somewhere else?" he stammered, looking horribly uncomfortable, "as though I'd been saying something shocking," thought Lenina. He couldn't look more upset if I'd made a dirty joke, asked him who his mother was, or something like that. I mean, with all these people about. He was choked with confusion. Lenina's laugh was frank and wholly unmalicious. "How funny you are," she said. And she quite genuinely did think him funny. "You'll give me at least a week's warning, won't you?" She went on in another tone. "I suppose we take the Blue Pacific rocket. Does it start from the Charing T Tower, or is it from Hampstead?" Before Bernard could answer, the lift came to a standstill. "Roof!" called a creaking voice. The liftman was a small simian creature, dressed in the black tunic of an Epsilon minus semi-moron. "Roof!" He flung open the gates. The warm glory of afternoon sunlight made him start and blink his eyes. "Oh, Roof!" he repeated in a voice of rapture. He was as though suddenly and joyfully awakened from a dark, annihilating stupor. "Roof!" He smiled up with a kind of doggedly expectant adoration into the faces of his passengers. Talking and laughing together, they stepped out into the light. The liftman looked after them. Roof? He said once more, questioningly. Then a bell rang, and from the ceiling of the lift a loudspeaker began, very softly and yet very imperiously, to issue its commands. Go down, it said. Go down, floor 18. Go down. Go down. Floor 18, go down. Go. The liftman slammed the gates, touched a button, and instantly dropped back into the droning twilight of the well, the twilight of his own habitual stupor. It was warm and bright on the roof. The summer afternoon was drowsy with the hum of passing helicopters, and the deeper drone of the rocket planes hastening, invisible through the night sky, bright sky, 5 or 6 miles overhead, was like a caress on the soft air. Bernard Marx drew a deep breath. He looked up into the sky and round the blue horizon, and finally down into Lenina's face. Isn't it beautiful? His voice trembled a little. She smiled at him, with an expression of the most sympathetic understanding. Simply perfect for obstacle golf, she answered rapturously. And now I must fly, Bernard. Henry gets cross if I keep him waiting. Let me know in good time about the date. And waving her hand, she ran away across the white flat roof towards the hangars. Bernard stood watching the retreating twinkle of the white stockings, the sunburned knees, vivaciously bending and unbending again, and the soft rolling of those well-fitted corduroy shorts beneath the bottle-green jacket. His face wore an expression of pain. I should say she was pretty, said a loud and cheery voice just behind him. Bernard started and looked around. The chubby red face of Benito Hoover was beaming down at him, beaming with manifest cordiality. Benito was notoriously good-natured. People said of him that he could have got through life without ever touching Soma. The malice and bad tempers from which other people had to take holidays never afflicted him. Reality for Benito was always sunny. Pneumatic too, and how? Then in another tone, but I say, he went on, you do look glum. What you need is a gram of Soma. Diving into his right-hand trouser pocket, Benito produced a file. 1 cubic centimeter cures 10 gloomy. But I say, Bernard was suddenly turned and rushed away. Benito stared after him. What can be the matter with the fellow? He wondered, and shaking his head, decided that the story about the alcohol having been put into the poor chap's blood surrogate must be true. Touched his brain, I suppose. He put away the Soma bottle, and taking out a packet of sex hormone chewing gum, stuffed the plug into his cheek and walked slowly away towards the hangars, ruminating. Henry Foster had had his machine wheeled out of its lock-up, and when Lenina arrived, was already seated in the cockpit, waiting. 4 minutes late, was always comment, as she climbed in beside him. He started the engine and threw the helicopter screws into gear. The machine shot vertically into the air. Henry accelerated. The humming of the propeller shrilled from hornet to wasp, from wasp to mosquito. The speedometer showed that they were rising at the best part of 2 kilometers per minute. London diminished beneath them. The huge table-topped buildings were no more. In a few seconds, then a bed of geometrical mushrooms sprouting from the green of park and garden. In the midst of them, thin-stalked a taller, slenderer fungus. The charring tea tower lifted towards the sky a disk of shining concrete. Like the vague torsos of fabulous athletes, huge fleshy clouds lolled on the blue air above their heads. Out of one of them suddenly dropped a small scarlet insect, buzzing as it fell. There's the red rocket, said Henry. Just come in from New York. Looking at his watch, 7 minutes behind time, he added, and shook his head. These Atlantic services, they're really scandalously unpunctual. He took his foot off the accelerator. The humming of the screws overhead dropped an octave and a half back through wasp and hornet to bumblebee, to cockchafer, to stag beetle. The upward rush of the machine slackened off. A moment later they were hanging motionlessly in the air. Henry pushed at a lever. There was a click, slowly at first, then faster and faster, till it was a circular mist before their eyes. The propeller in front of them began to revolve. The winds of a horizontal speed whistled ever more shrilly in the air, in the stays. Henry kept his eyes on the revolution counter. When the needle touched the 1200 mark, he threw the helicopter's screws out of gear. The machine had enough forward momentum to be able to fly on its planes. Lenina looked down through the window in the floor beneath her feet. They were flying over the 6-kilometer zone of parkland that separated central London from its first ring of satellite suburbs. The green was maggoty with foreshortened life. Forests of centrifugal bumble poppy towers gleamed beneath the trees. Near Shepherd's Bush, 2,000 beta-minus mixed doubles were playing Riemann surface tennis. A double row of escalator 5s courts lined the main road from Notting Hill to Williston. In the Ealing Stadium, a Delta gymnastic display and community sing was in progress. "What a hideous color khaki is," remarked Lenina, voicing the hypnopedic prejudice of her caste. The buildings of the Hounslow Feely studio covered 7.5 hectares. Near them a black and khaki army of laborers was busy revitrifying the surface of the Great West Road. One of the huge traveling crucibles was being tapped as they flew over. The molten stone poured out in a stream of dazzling incandescence across the road. The asbestos rollers came and went. At the tail of an insulated watering cart the steam rose in white clouds. At Brentford, the television corporation's factory was like a small town. "They must be changing the shift," said Nina. Like aphids and ants, the leaf green gamma girls, the black semi-morons swarmed round the entrance, or stood in queues to take their places in the monorail tramcars. Mulberry-colored beta-minuses came and went among the crowd. The roof of the main building was alive with the lightning and departure of helicopters. "My word," said Lenina, "I'm glad I'm not a gamma." 10 minutes later they were at Stoke Poach and had started their first round of obstacle golf. With eyes for the most part downcast, and if ever they lighted on a fellow creature at once and furtively averted, Bennett hastened across the roof. He was like a man pursued, but pursued by enemies he does not wish to see, lest they should seem more hostile even than he had supposed, and he himself be made to feel guiltier and even more helplessly alone. That horrible Benito Hoover! And yet the man had meant well enough, which only made it, in a way, much worse. Those who meant well behaved in the same way as those who meant badly. Even Nina was making him suffer. He remembered those weeks of timid indecision, during which he had looked and longed and despaired of ever having the courage to ask her. Dared he face the risk of being humiliated by a contemptuous refusal? But if she were to say yes, what a rapture! Well, now she had said it, and he was still wretched. Wretched that she should have thought it such a perfect afternoon for obstacle golf, that she should have trotted away to join Henry Foster, that she should have found him funny for not wanting to talk of their most private affairs in public. Wretched, in a word, because she had behaved as any healthy and virtuous English girl ought to behave, and not in some other abnormal, extraordinary way. He opened the door of his lockup and called to a lounging couple of Delta Minus attendants to come and push his machine out onto the roof. The hangars were staffed by a single Bokanovsky group, and the men were twins, identically small, black, and hideous. Burnett gave his orders in the sharp, rather arrogant, and even offensive tone of one who does not feel himself too secure in his superiority. To have dealings with members of the lower castes was always, for Bernard, a most distressing experience. For whatever the cause, and the current gossip about the alcohol in his blood surrogate may very likely, for accidents will happen, have been true, Bernard's physique was hardly better than that of the average Gamma. He stood 8 centimeters short of the standard Alpha height, and was slender in proportion. Contact with members of the lower castes always reminded him painfully of his physical inadequacy. I am I, and wish I wasn't. His self-consciousness was acute and distressing. Each time he found himself looking on the level, instead of downward, into a Delta's face, he felt humiliated. Would the creature treat him with the respect due to his caste? The question haunted him, not without reason, for Gammas, Deltas, and Epsilons had been to some extent conditioned to associate corporeal mass with social superiority. Indeed, a faint, hypnopedic prejudice in favor of size was universal. Hence the laughter of women to whom he had made proposals, the practical joking of his equals among the men. The mockery made him feel an outsider, and feeling an outsider he behaved like one, which increased the prejudice against him and intensified the contempt and hostility aroused by his physical defects, which in turn increased his sense of being alien and alone. A chronic fear of being slighted made him avoid his equals, made him stand where his inferiors were concerned, self-consciously on his dignity. How bitterly he envied men like Henry Foster and Benito Hoover, men who never had to shout at an epsilon to get an order obeyed, men who took their positions for granted, men who moved through the caste system as a fish through water, so utterly at home as to be unaware either of themselves or of the beneficent and comfortable element in which they had their being. Slackly it seemed to him, and with reluctance, the twin attendants wheeled his plane out onto the roof. "Hurry up," said Bernard irritably. One of them glanced at him. Was that a kind of bestial derision that he detected in those blank grey eyes? "Hurry up," he shouted more loudly, and there was an ugly rasp in his voice. He climbed into the plane and, a minute later, was flying southwards, towards the river. The various Bureau of Propaganda and the College of Emotional Engineering were housed in a single 60-story building in Fleet Street. In the basement and on the lower floors were the presses and offices of the 3 great London newspapers, the Hourly Radio, an upper caste sheet, the pale green Gamma Gazette, and on khaki paper and in words exclusively of one syllable, the Delta Mirror. Then came the Bureau of Propaganda by television, by feeling picture, and by synthetic voice and music respectively. 22 floors of them. Above were the research laboratories and the padded rooms in which the soundtrack writers and synthetic composers did their delicate work. The top 18 floors were occupied by the College of Emotional Engineering. Bernard landed on the roof of Propaganda House and stepped out. "Ring down to Mr. Helmholtz Watson," he ordered the Gamma Plus porter, "and tell him that Mr. Bernard Marx is waiting for him on the roof." He sat down and lit a cigarette. Helmholtz Watson was writing when the message came down. "Tell him I'm coming at once," he said, and hung up the receiver. Then, turning to his secretary, "I'll leave you to put my things away." He went on in the same official and impersonal tone, and, ignoring her lustrous smile, got up and walked briskly to the door. He was a powerful built man, deep-chested, broad-shouldered, massive, and yet quick in his movements, springy and agile. The round, strong pillar of his neck supported a beautifully shaped head. His hair was dark and curly, his features strongly marked. In a forcibly empathetic way, he was handsome and looked, as his secretary was never tired of repeating, every centimeter an Alpha Plus. By profession, he was a lecturer at the College of Emotional Engineering, Department of Writing, and in the interval of his educational activities, a working emotional engineer. He wrote regularly for the hourly radio, composed feely scenarios, and had the happiest knack for slogans and hypnopedic rhymes. Able was the verdict of his superiors, perhaps, and they would shake their heads, would significantly lower their voices, a little too able. Yes, a little too able. They were right. A mental excess had produced in Helmholtz Watson effects very similar to those which, in Bernard Marx, were the results of a physical defect. Too little bone and brawn had isolated Bernard from his fellow men, and the sense of his apartness, being by all the current standards a mental excess, became its turn a cause of wider separation. That which had made Helmholtz so uncomfortably aware of being himself and all alone was too much ability. What the two men shared was the knowledge that they were individuals, but whereas the physically defective Bernard had suffered all his life from the consciousness of being separate, it was only quite recently that, grown aware of his mental excess, Helmholtz Watson had also become aware of his difference from the people who surrounded him. This escalator squash champion, this indefatigable lover, it was said that he had had 640 different girls in under 4 years. This admirable committee man and best mixer had realized quite suddenly that sport, women, communal activities were only, so far as he was concerned, second bests. Really, and at the bottom, he was interested in something else. But in what? In what? That was the problem which Bernard had come to discuss with him, or rather, since it was always Helmholtz who did all of the talking, to listen to his friend discussing yet once more. 3 charming girls from the Bureau of Propaganda, by synthetic voice, waylaid him as he stepped out of the lift. "Oh, Helmholtz, darling, do come and have a picnic supper with us on Exmoor." They clung round him imploringly. He shook his head. He pushed his way through them. "No, no, we're not inviting any other man." But Helmholtz remained unshaken even by this delightful promise. "No," he repeated, "I'm busy." And he held resolutely on his course. The girls trailed after him. It was not till he had actually climbed into Bernard's plane and slammed the door that they gave up pursuit, not without reproaches. "These women," he said, as the machine rose into the air. "These women." And he shook his head. He frowned. "Too awful," Bernard hypocritically agreed, wishing as he spoke the words that he could have as many girls as Helmholtz did, and with as little trouble. He was seized with a sudden urgent need to boast. "I'm taking Lenina Crown to New Mexico with me," he said in a tone as casual as he could make it. "Are you?" said Helmholtz, with a total absence of interest. Then, after a little pause, "This last week or two," he went on, "I've been cutting all my committees and all my girls. You can't imagine what a hullabaloo they've been making about it at the college. Still, it's been worth it, I think. The effects," he hesitated, "well, they're odd. They're very odd. A physical shortcoming could produce a kind of mental excess. The process, it seemed, was reversible. Mental excess could produce, for its own purposes, the voluntary blindness and deafness of delicate, deliberate solitude, the artificial impotence of asceticism. The rest of the short flight was accomplished in silence. When they had arrived and were comfortably stretched out on the pneumatic sofas in Bernard's room, Helmholtz began again, speaking very slowly. "Did you ever feel," he asked, "as though you had something inside you that was only waiting for you to give it a chance to come out? Some sort of extra power that you aren't using, you know, like all the water that goes down the falls instead of through the turbines. He looked at Bernard questioningly. You mean all the emotions one might be feeling if things were different? Helmholtz shook his head. Not quite. I'm thinking of a queer feeling I sometimes get. A feeling that I've got something important to say, and the power to say it. Only I don't know what it is, and I can't make any use of the power. If there was some different way of writing, or else something else to write about. He was silent. Then, you see, he went on at last, I'm pretty good at inventing phrases. You know, the sort of words that suddenly make you jump, almost as though you'd sat on a pin. They seem so new and exciting, even though they're about something hypnopathically obvious. But that doesn't seem enough. It's not enough for the phrases to be good. What you make with them ought to be good too. But your things are good, Helmholtz. Oh, as far as they go. Helmholtz shrugged with his shoulders. But they go such a little way. They aren't important enough, somehow. I feel I could do something much more important. Yes, and more intense, more violent. But what? What is there more important to say? And how can one be violent about the sort of thing one once expected to write about? Words can be like x-rays. If you use them properly, they'll go through anything you read and you're pierced. That's the one of the things I try to teach my students, how to write piercingly. But what on earth's the good of being pierced by an article about a community sing, or the latest improvement in scent organs? Besides, can you make words really piercing? You know, like the very hardest x-rays? When you're writing about the sort of thing, that sort of thing, can you say something about nothing? That's what it finally boils down to. I try and I try. Hush, said Bernard suddenly, and I lifted a warning finger. They listened. I believe there's somebody at the door, he whispered. Helmholtz got up, tiptoed across the room, and with a sharp, quick movement flung the door wide open. There was, of course, nobody there. I'm sorry, said Bernard, feeling and looking uncomfortably foolish. I suppose I've got things on my nerves a bit. When people are suspicious with you, you start being suspicious with them. He passed his hand across his eyes. He sighed. His voice became plaintive. He was justifying himself. If you knew what I had had to put up with recently, he said almost tearfully, and the uprush of self-pity was like a fountain suddenly released. If only you knew! Helmholtz Watson listened with a certain sense of discomfort. Poor little Bernard, he said to himself, but at the same time he felt rather ashamed for his friend. He wished Bernard would show a little more pride. Okay, chapter 5. I'm quickly gonna close my blinds, so I'll be right back. You can enjoy me hearing me close my blinds, I guess. Or curtains, I guess, would be a more fitting name. But blinds works. Lights on. Lights, camera, action. Okay. Chapter 5. By 8 o'clock, the light was failing. The loudspeakers in the tower of the Stoke Podges Club house began, and in a more than human tenor, to announce the closing of the courses. Lenina and Henry abandoned their game, and walked back towards the club. From the grounds of the Internal and External Secretion Trust came the lowing of those thousands of cattle which provided, with their hormones and their milk, the raw materials for the great factory at Farnham Royal. An incessant buzzing of helicopters filled the twilight. Every 2.5 minutes, a bell and the screech of whistles announced the departure of one of the light monorail trains, which carried the lower caste golfers back from their separate course to the metropolis. Lenina and Henry climbed into their machine and started off. At 800 feet, Henry slowed down the helicopter's cruise, and they hung for a minute or two, poised above a fading landscape. The forest of Burnham beaches stretched like a great pool of darkness towards the bright shore of the western sky. Crimson at the horizon, the last of the sunset faded. Through orange, upwards into yellow and a pale watery green. Northwards, beyond and above the trees, the internal and external secretions factory glared with a fierce electric brilliance from every window of its 20 stories. Beneath them lay the buildings of the golf club, the huge lower caste barracks, and on the other side of a dividing wall, the smaller houses reserved for alphas and beta members. The approaches to the monorail station were black with ant-like population of lower caste activity. From under the glass vault, a lighted train shot out into the open. Following its southerly course across the dark plain, their eyes were drawn to the majestic buildings of the slow crematorium. For the safety of night-flying planes, its 4 tall chimneys were floodlighted and tipped with crimson danger signals. It was a landmark. "Why do the smokestacks have those things like balconies around them?" inquired Lenina. "Phosphorus recovery," explained Henry telegraphically. On their way up the chimney, the gases go through 4 separate treatments. P2O5 used to go right out of circulation every time they cremated someone. Now they recover over 98% of it, more than 1.5 kilos per adult corpse, which makes the best part of 400 tons of phosphorus every year from England alone. Henry spoke with a happy pride, rejoicing wholeheartedly in the achievement, as though it had been his own. "Fine to think we can go on being socially useful even after we're dead, making plants grow." Lenina, meanwhile, had turned her eyes away and was looking perpendicularly downwards at the monorail station. "Fine," she agreed, "but queer that alphas and betas won't make any more plants grow than those nasty little gammas and deltas and epsilons down there." "All men are physico-chemically equal," said Henry sententiously. "Besides, even epsilons perform indispensable services. Even an epsilon," Lenina suddenly remembered, an occasion when, as a little girl at school, she had woken up in the middle of the night and become aware, for the first time, of the whisperings that had haunted all her sleeps. She saw again the beam of moonlight, the rows of small white beds, heard once more the soft voice that said the words were there, unforgettable after so many night-long repetitions. "Everyone works for everyone else. We can't do without anyone. Even epsilons are useful. We couldn't do without epsilons. Everyone works for everyone else. We can't do without anyone." Lenina remembered her first shock of fear and surprise, her speculations through half a wakeful hour, and then, under the influence of those endless repetitions, the gradual soothing of her mind, the smoothing, the stealthy creeping of sleep. "I suppose epsilons don't really mind being epsilons," she said aloud. "Of course they don't. How can they? They don't know what it's like being anything else. We'd mind, of course, but then we'd have been differently conditioned. Besides, we start with a different heredity. I'm glad I'm not an epsilon," said Lenina with conviction. "And if you were an epsilon," said Henry, "your conditioning would have made you no less thankful that you weren't a beta or an alpha." He put his forward propeller into gear and headed the machine towards London. Behind them, in the west, the crimson and orange were almost faded. A dark bank of cloud had crept into the zenith. As they flew over the crematorium, the plane shot upwards on the column of hot air rising from the chimneys. only to fall as suddenly when it passed into the descending chill beyond. What a marvelous switchback, Lenina laughed delightedly. But Henry's tone was almost, for a moment, melancholy. Do you know what that switchback was? He said. It was some human being finally and definitely disappearing, going up in a squirt of hot gas. It would be curious to know who it was. A man or a woman, an alpha or an epsilon. He sighed. Then, in a resolutely cheerful voice, anyhow, he concluded, there's one thing we can be certain of. Whoever he may have been, he was happy when he was alive. Everyone's happy now. Yes, everybody's happy now, echoed Lenina. They had heard the words repeated 150 times every night for 12 years. Landing on the roof of Henry's 40-story apartment house in Westminster, they went straight down to the dining hall. There, in a loud and cheerful company, they ate an excellent meal. Soma was served with the coffee. Lenina took 2 half-gram tablets, and Henry 3. At 9:20, they walked across the street into the newly opened Westminster Abbey Cabaret. It was a night almost without clouds, moonless and starry, but of this one, the whole depressing fact that Lenina and Henry were fortunately unaware. The electric sky signs effectively shut off the outer darkness. Calvin Stopes and his 16 saxophonists. From the facade of the new abbey, the giant letters invitingly glared. London's finest scent and color organ, all the latest synthetic music. They entered. The air seemed hot and somehow breathless, with the scent of ambergris and sandalwood. On the domed ceiling of the hall, the color organ had momentarily painted a tropical sunset. The 16 saxophonists were playing an old favorite. There ain't no bottle in all the world like that dear little bottle of mine. 400 couples were 5-stepping round the polished floor. Lenina and Henry were soon the 401st. The saxophones wailed like melodious cats under the moon, moaned in the alto and tenor registers as though the little deaf were upon them. Rich with a wealth of harmonics, that tremulous chorus mounted towards a climax, louder and ever louder, until at last, with a wave of his hand, the conductor let loose the final shattering note of even music and blew the 16 merely human blowers clean out of existence. Thunder in a A-flat minor, and then, in all but silence, in all but darkness, there followed a gradual detergence sense, a diminuendo, sliding gradually through quarter tones down to a faintly whispering dominant chord that lingered on, while the 5/4 rhythms still pulsed below, charging the darkened seconds with an intense expectancy, and at last expectancy was fulfilled. There was a sudden explosive sunrise, and simultaneously the 16 burst into song. Bottle of mine, it is you I've always wanted. Bottle of mine, why was I ever decanted? Skies are blue inside of you. The weather's always fine, for there ain't no bottle in all the world like that dear little bottle of mine. 5-stepping with the other 400 round Westminster Abbey, Lenina and Henry were yet dancing in another world, the warm, the richly colored, the infinitely friendly world of Soma Holiday. How kind, how good-looking, how delightfully amusing everyone was. Bottle of mine, it's you I've always wanted. But Lenina and Henry had what they wanted. They were inside, here and now, safely inside with the fine weather, the perennially blue sky, and when exhausted the 16 had laid by their saxophones and the synthetic music apparatus was producing the very latest in slow Malthusian blues. They might have been twin embryos, gently rocking together on the waves of a bottled ocean of blood surrogate. Good night, dear friends. Good night, dear friends. The loudspeaker veiled their commands in a genial and musical politeness. Good night, dear friends. Obediently, with all the others, Lenina and Henry left the building. The depressing stars had traveled quite some way across the heavens, though the separating screen of the sky signs had now to a great extent dissolved. The two young people still retained their happy ignorance of the night. Swallowing half an hour before closing time the second dose of soma had raised a quite impenetrable wall between the actual universe and their minds. Bottled. They crossed the street, bottled. They took the lift up to Henry's room on the 28th floor. And yet, bottled as she was, and in spite of the second gram of soma, Lenina did not forget to take all the contraceptive precautions prescribed by the regulations. Years of intensive hypnopedia and, from 12 to 17, Malthusian drill, 3 times a week, had made the taking of these precautions almost as automatic and inevitable as blinking. Oh, and that reminds me, she said, as she came back from the bathroom. Fanny Crow wants to know where you found that lovely green Morocco surrogate cartridge belt you gave me. Alternate Thursdays were Bernard's Solidarity Service days. After an early dinner at the Aphroditeum, to which Helmholtz had recently been elected under Rule 2, he took leave of his friend and, hailing a taxi on the roof, told the man to fly to the Fordson Community Singery. The machine rose a couple of 100 meters and then headed eastwards. As it turned, there before Bernard's eyes, gigantically beautiful, was the Singery, floodlighted, its 320 meters of white Carrara surrogate gleamed with a snowy incandescence over Ludgate Hill. At each of the 4 corners of its helicopter platform, an intense tea shone crimson against the night, and from the mouths of 24 vast golden trumpets rumbled a solemn synthetic music. Damn, I'm late, Burton said to himself, as he first caught sight of Big Henry, the Singery clock. And sure enough, as he was paying off his cab, Big Henry sounded the hour. Ford, sang out an immense bass voice from all the golden trumpets. Ford! 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 9 times. Bernard ran for the lift. The great auditorium for Ford's Day celebrations and other masked community sings was at the bottom of the building. Above it, 100 to each floor, were the 7,000 rooms used by solidarity groups for their fortnight services. Bernard dropped down to floor 33, hurried along the corridor, stood hesitating for a moment outside room 3210, then, having wound himself up, opened the door and walked in. Thank Ford, he was not the last. 3 chairs of the 12 arranged round the circular table were still unoccupied. He slipped into the nearest of them as inconspicuously as he could, and he prepared to frown at yet later comers whenever they should arrive. Turning towards him, "What were you playing this afternoon?" the girl on his left inquired. "Obstacle or electromagnetic?" Bernard looked at her. "Ford, it was Morgana Rothschild," and blushingly had to admit that he had been playing neither. Morgana stared at him with astonishment. There was an awkward silence. Then pointedly she turned away and addressed herself to a more sporting man on her left. A good beginning for a solidarity service, thought Bernard miserably, and foresaw for himself yet another failure to achieve atonement. If only he had given himself time to look around instead of scuttling for the nearest chair. He could have sat between Fifi Bradlove and Jonah Diesel, instead of which he had gone and blindly planted himself next to Morgana. Morgana! Ford, those black eyebrows of hers, that eyebrow rather, for they met above the nose. Ford, and on his right was Clara Detterding. True, Clara's eyebrows didn't meet, but she was really too pneumatic, whereas Fifi and Joanna were absolutely right. Plump, blonde, not too large, and it was that great loud, Tom Kawaguchi, who now took their seat between them. The last arrival was Sorojinji Angles. "You're late," said the president of the group severely. "Don't let it happen again." Sorojinji apologized and slid into her place between Jim Bokanovsky and Herbert Bakunin. The group was now complete. The solidarity circle perfect and without flaw. Man, woman, man in a ring of endless alternation round the table, 12 of them ready to be made one, waiting to come together, to be fused, to lose their 12 separate identities in a larger being. The president stood up, made the sign of the T, and switching on the synthetic music, let loose the soft, indefatigable beatings of drums and a choir of instruments, near wind and superstring, that plangently repeated and repeated that brief and unescapable haunting melody of the first Solidarity hymn. Again, again, and it was not the ear that heard the pulsing rhythm, it was the midriff, the wail and clang of those recurring harmonies haunted, not the mind, but the yearning bowels of compassion. The president made another sign of the T and sat down. The service had begun. The dedicated Soma tablets were placed in the center of the table. The loving cup of strawberry ice cream Soma was passed from hand to hand, and, with the formula, "I drink to my annihilation," 12 times quaved. Then, to the accompaniment of the synthetic orchestra, the first Solidarity hymn was sung. "Forth we are 12, oh make us one, like drops within the social river. Oh make us one now together run, as swiftly as thy shining flivver." 12 yearning stanzas, and then the loving cup was passed a second time. "I drink to the greater being" was now the formula. All drank, tirelessly the music played. The drums beat, the crying and clashing of the harmonies were an obsession in the melted bowels. The second Solidarity hymn was sung. "Come, greater being, social friend, annihilating 12 in one. We long to die, for when we end, our larger life has but begun." Again 12 stanzas. By this time the Soma had begun to work. Eyes shone, cheeks were flushed, the inner light of universal benevolence broke out on every face in happy, friendly smiles. Even Bernard felt himself a little melted. When Morgana Rothschild turned and beamed at him, he did his best to beam back, but the eyebrow, that black 2-in-1, alas, it was still there. He couldn't ignore it. Couldn't. However hard he tried. The melting hadn't gone far enough. Perhaps if he had been sitting between Fifi and Joanna. For the third time the loving cup went round. "I drink to the imminence of his coming," said Morgana Rothschild, whose turn it happened to be to initiate the circular rite. Her tone was loud, exultant. She drank and passed the cup to Bernard. "I drink to the imminence of his coming," he repeated, with a sincere attempt to feel that the coming was imminent. But the eyebrow continued to haunt him, and the coming, so far as he was concerned, was horribly remote. He drank and handed the cup to Clara Detterding. "It will be a failure again," he said to himself. "I know it will." But he went on doing his best to beam. The loving cup had made its circuit. Lifting his hand, the president gave a signal. The chorus broke out into the third Solidarity hymn. "Feel how the greater being comes. Rejoice and in rejoicings die. Melt in the music of the drums. For I am you and you are I." As verse succeeded verse, the voice thrilled with an ever intenser excitement. The sense of the coming's imminence was like an electric tension in the air. The president switched off the music, and with the final note of the final stanza, there was absolute silence. the silence of a stretched expectancy, quivering and creeping with a galvanic life. The president reached out his hand, and suddenly a voice, a deep, strong voice, more musical than any merely human voice, richer, warmer, more vibrant with love and yearning and compassion, a wonderful, mysterious, supernatural voice, spoke from above their heads, very slowly. "Oh, Ford, Ford, Ford," it said diminishingly, and on a descending scale. A sensation of warmth radiated thrillingly out from the solar plexus to every extremity of the bodies of those who listened. Tears came into their eyes, their hearts, their bowels seemed to move within them, as though with an independent life. Ford, they were melting. Ford, dissolved. Dissolved, then in another tone, suddenly startlingly, "Listen!" trumpeted the voice. "Listen!" They listened. After a pause, sunk to a whisper, but a whisper somehow more penetrating than the loudest cry. "The feet of the greater being," it went on, and repeated the words. "The feet of the greater being." The whisper almost expired. "The feet of the greater being are on the stairs." And once more there was a silence, and the expectancy momentarily relaxed, was stretched again, tauter, tauter, almost to the tearing point. The feet of the greater being. Oh, they heard them. They heard them, coming softly down the stairs, coming nearer and nearer down the invisible stairs. The feet of the greater being. And suddenly the tearing point was reached. Her eyes staring, her lips parted, Morgana Rothschild sprang to her feet. "I hear him!" she cried. "I hear him!" "He's coming!" shouted Sarangi Angles. "Yes, he's coming! I hear him!" Fifi Bradlaugh and Tom Kawaguchi rose simultaneously to their feet. "Oh, oh, oh!" Joanna inarticulately testified. "He's coming?" yelled Jim Bokanowski. The president leaned forward and with a touch released a delirium of cymbals and blown brass, a fever of tom-tomming. "Oh, he's coming!" screamed Clara Deserting. And it was as though she were having her throat cut. Feeling that it was time for him to do something, Bernard also jumped up and shouted, "I hear him! He's coming!" But it wasn't true. He heard nothing, and for him, nobody was coming. Nobody, in spite of the music, in spite of the mounting excitement. But he waved his arms, he shouted with the best of them. And when the others began to jig and stamp and shuffle, he also jigged and shuffled. Round they went, a circular procession of dancers, each with hands on the hips of the dancer preceding, round and round, shouting in unison, stamping to the rhythm of the music with their feet, beating it out with hands on the buttocks in front, 12 pairs of hands beating as one, 12 buttocks slabily resounding, 12 as one, 12 as one. I hear him coming. The music quickened, faster beat the feet, faster felt the rhythmic hands, and all at once a great synthetic bass boomed out the words which announced the approaching atonement and final consummation of solidarity, the coming of the 12 in one, the incarnation of the greater being. "Orgy porgy," it sang, while the tom-toms continued to beat their feverish tattoo. "Orgy porgy, Ford and fun, kiss the girls and make them one. Boys at one, with girls at peace, orgy porgy gives release." "Orgy porgy," the dancer caught up the liturgical refrain. "Orgy porgy, Ford and fun, kiss the girls." And as they sang, the lights began slowly to fade and at the same time to grow warmer, richer, redder, until at last they were dancing in the crimson twilight of an embryo store. Orgy porgy. In the blood-colored and fetal darkness the dancers continued for a while to circulate, to beat and beat out the indefatigable rhythm. "Orgy porgy." Then the circle wavered, broke, fell in partially disintegration on the ring of couches which surrounded. Circle enclosing circle. The table and its planetary chairs. Orgy porgy. Tenderly the deep voice crooned and cooed. In the red twilight it was thought some enormous negro dove were hovering benevolently over the now prone or supine dancers. They were standing on the roof. Big Henry had just sung 11. The night was calm and warm. "Wasn't it wonderful?" said Phoebe Bradlove. "Wasn't it simply wonderful?" She looked at Bernard with an expression of rapture, but of rapture in which there was no trace of agitation or excitement. For to be excited is still to be unsatisfied. Hers was the calm ecstasy of achieved consummation, the peace, not of mere vacant satiety and nothingness, but of balanced life, of energies at rest and in equilibrium, a rich and living peace, for the solidarity service had given as well as taken, drawn off only to replenish. She was full, she was made perfect. She was still more than merely herself. "Didn't you think it was wonderful?" she insisted, looking into Bernard's eyes. Looking into Bernard's face with those supernaturally shining eyes. "Yes, I thought it was wonderful." He lied and looked away. The sight of her transfigured face was at once an accusation and an ironical reminder of his own separateness. He was as miserably isolated now as he had been when the service began, more isolated by reason of his unreplenished emptiness, his dead satiety, separate and unatoned, while the others were being fused into the greater being, alone even in Morgana's embrace, much more alone, indeed more hopelessly himself than he had ever been in his life before. He had emerged from that crimson twilight into the common electric glare with a self-consciousness intensified to the pitch of agony. He was utterly miserable, and perhaps, her shining eyes accused him, perhaps it was his own fault. "Quite wonderful," he repeated, but the only thing he could think of was Morgana's eyebrow. Orgy poetry. Kind of weird to read that out loud, but yeah. That was chapter 5. So, actually, I'm gonna take a little sippy of water and then we'll continue. So, give me a couple secs. Oh, and by the way, I must defend myself because when they were at the concert hall, Henry and the girl, Lenina, there was talk of saxophones, and it might sound like I misspoke saxophones, but they're actually saxophones, like SEX. And that's also why the sound was described as moaning and exultant and climactic and stuff. So it does work, but I just thought I should clarify that, seeing as you can read the letters I'm reading. Yeah, let's get into chapter 6 and finish off for today. Odd, odd, odd was Lenina's verdict on Bernard Marx. So odd, indeed, that in the course of the succeeding weeks, she had wondered more than once whether she shouldn't change her mind about the New Mexico holiday, and go instead to the North Pole with Benito Hoover. The trouble was that she knew the North Pole, had been there with George Edsel only last summer, and there was more, found it pretty grim. Nothing to do and the hotel too hopelessly old-fashioned. No television laid on in the bedrooms, no scent organ, only the most putrid synthetic music, and not more than 25 escalated squash courts for over 200 guests. No, decidedly she couldn't face the North Pole again. Added to which, she had only been to America once before, and even then how inadequately. A cheap weekend in New York. Had it been with Jean-Jacques Habibullah, or Bokanovsky Jones? She couldn't remember. Anyhow, it was of absolutely no importance. The prospect of flying west again, and for a whole week, was very inviting. Moreover, for at least 3 days of that week they would be in the Savage Reservation. Not more than half a dozen people in the whole center had ever been inside the Savage Reservation. As an Alpha Plus psychologist, Bernard was one of the few men she knew entitled to a permit. For Lenina, the opportunity was unique, and yet so unique also was Bernard's oddness that she had hesitated to take it, had actually thought of risking the pole again with funny old Benito. At least Benito was normal, whereas Bernard, alcohol in his blood surrogate, was Fanny's explanation of every eccentricity. But Henry, with whom one evening, when they were in bed together, Lenina had rather anxiously discussed her new lover, Bernard had compared poor Bernard to Henry had compared poor Bernard to a rhinoceros. You can't teach a rhinoceros tricks, he had explained in his brief and vigorous style. Some men are almost rhinoceroses. They don't respond properly to conditioning. Poor devils. Bernard's one of them. Luckily for him, he's pretty good at his job. Otherwise the director wouldn't never have kept him. However, he added consolingly, I think he's pretty harmless. Pretty harmless, perhaps, but also pretty disquieting. That mania, to start with, for doing things in private, which meant, in practice, not doing anything at all. For what was there one could do in private, apart, of course, from going to bed? But one couldn't do that all the time. Yes, what was there? Precious little. The first afternoon they went out together was particularly fine. Lenina had suggested a swim at Tukoi Country Club, followed by dinner at the Oxford Union, but Bernard thought it would be too much of a crowd. Then, what about a round of electromagnetic golf at St. Andrews? But again, no. Bernard considered that electromagnetic golf was a waste of time. Then, what's time for? Asked Lenina in some astonishment. Apparently, for going for walks in the Lake District, for that was what he now proposed. Land on the top of Skiddaw and walk for a couple of hours in the heather, alone with you, Lenina. But, Bernard, we shall be alone all night. Bernard blushed and looked away. I meant alone for talking, he mumbled. Talking? But what about? Walking and talking. That seemed a very odd way of spending an afternoon. In the end she persuaded him, much against his will, to fly over to Amsterdam to see the semi-demi finals of the women's heavyweight wrestling championship. In a crowd, he grumbled, as usual. He remained obstinately gloomy the whole afternoon, wouldn't talk to Lenina's friends, of whom they met dozens in the ice cream Soma bar between the wrestling bouts, and in spite of his misery absolutely refused to take a half-gram of raspberry sundae which she pressed upon him. I'd rather be myself, he said. Myself and nasty, not somebody else, however jolly. A gram in time saves 9, said Lenina, producing a bright treasure of sleep-taught wisdom. Bernard pushed away the pre-offered glass impatiently. Now don't lose your temper, she said. Remember 1 cubic centimeter cues 10 gloomy sentiments. Oh, for God's sake, be quiet, he shouted. Lenina shrugged her shoulders. A gram is always better than a damn, she concluded with dignity, and drank the sundae herself. On their way back across the channel, Bernard insisted on stopping his propeller and hovering on his helicopter screws within 100 feet of the waves. The weather had taken a change for the worse. A southwesterly wind had sprung up. The sky was cloudy. Look, he commanded. But it's horrible, said Lenina, shrinking back from the window. She was appalled by the rushing emptiness of the sky, by the black, foam-flecked water heaving beneath them, by the pale face of the moon, so haggard and distracted among the hastening clouds. Let's turn on the radio, quick! She reached for the dialing knob on the dashboard and turned it at random. Skies are blue inside of you, sang 16 tremoloing falsettos. The weather's always, then a hiccup and a silence. Bernard had switched off the current. I want to look at the sea in peace, he said. One can't even look with that beastly noise going on. But it's lovely, and I don't want to look. But I do, he insisted. It makes me feel as though... He hesitated, searching for words with which to express himself. As though I were more me, if you see what I mean. More on my own, not so completely a part of something else. Not just a cell in the social body. Doesn't it make you feel like that, Lenina? But Lenina was crying. It's horrible, she kept repeating. And how can you talk like that about not wanting to be part of the social body? After all, everyone works for everyone else. We can't do without anyone. Even epsilons. Yes, I know, said Bernard derisively. Even epsilons are useful. So am I. And I damn well wish I weren't. Lenina was shocked by this blasphemy. Bernard, she protested in a voice of amazed distress. How can you? In a different key. How can I? He repeated meditatively. No, the real problem is, how is it that I can't? Or rather, because, after all, I know quite well why I can't. What would it be like if I could? If I were free, not enslaved by my conditioning? But Bernard, you're saying the most awful things. Don't you wish you were free, Lenina? I don't know what you mean. I am free. Free to have the most wonderful life. Everybody's happy nowadays. He laughed. Yes, everybody is happy nowadays. We begin giving the children that at 5. But wouldn't you like to be free to be happy in some other way, Lenina? In your own way, for example, not in everyone else's way. I don't know what you mean, she repeated, then turning to him. Oh, do let's go back, Bernard, she besought. I do hate it here. Don't you like being with me? But of course, Bernard. But this horrible place. I thought we'd be more together here, with nothing but the sea and the moon, more together than in that crowd, or even in my rooms. Don't you understand that? I don't understand anything, she said with decision, determined to preserve her incomprehension intact. Nothing, least of all, she continued in another tone. Why you don't take Soma when you have these dreadful ideas of yours? You'd forget all about them, and instead of feeling miserable, you'd be jolly. So jolly, she repeated, and smiled, for all the puzzled anxiety in her eyes, with what was meant to be an inviting and voluptuous cajolery. He looked at her in silence, his face unresponsive and very grave. Looked at her intently. After a few seconds, Lenina's eyes flinched away. She uttered a nervous little laugh, tried to think of something to say and couldn't. The silence prolonged itself. When Bernard spoke at last, it was in a small, tired voice. All right then, he said, we'll go back. And stepping hard on the accelerator, he sent the machine rocketing up into the sky. At 4,000, he started his propeller. They flew in silence for a minute or two. Then, suddenly, Bernard began to laugh. Rather oddly, Lenina thought, but still it was laughter. Feeling better, she ventured to ask. For answer, he lifted one hand from the controls and, slipping his arm around her, began to fondle her breast. Thank God, she said to herself, he is all right again. Half an hour later they were back in his rooms. Bernard swallowed 4 tablets of Soma at a gulp, turned on the radio and television and began to undress. Well, Lenina inquired with significant archness when they met next afternoon on the roof. Did you think it was fun yesterday? Bernard nodded. They climbed into the plane, a little jolt, and they were off. Everyone says I'm awfully pneumatic, said Lenina, reflectively patting her own legs. Awfully. But there was an expression of pain in Bernard's eyes. Like meat, he was thinking. She looked up with a certain anxiety. But you don't think I'm too plump, do you? He shook his head. Like so much meat. You think I'm all right. Another nod. In every way? Perfect, he said aloud. And inwardly, she thinks of herself that way. She doesn't mind being meat. Lenina smiled triumphantly, but her satisfaction was premature. All the same, he went on after a little pause, I still rather wish it had all ended differently. Differently? Were there other endings? I didn't want it to end with our going to bed, he specified. Lenina was astonished. Not at once, not the first day. But then what? He began to talk a lot of incomprehensible and dangerous nonsense. Lenina did her best to stop the ears of her mind, but every now and then a phrase would insist on becoming audible. To try the effects of arresting my impulses, she heard him say. The word seemed to touch a spring in her mind. Never put off till tomorrow the fun you can have today, she said gravely. 200 repetitions, twice a week for 14 to 16 and a half, was all his comment. The mad, bad talk rambled on. I want to know what passion is, she heard him saying. I want to feel something strongly. When the individual feels, the community reels, Lenina pronounced. Well, why shouldn't it reel a bit? Burn it! But Bernard remained unabashed. Adults, intellectually and during working hours, he went on, infants where feeling and desire are concerned. Or Ford loves infants. Ignoring the interruption, it suddenly struck me the other day, continued Bernard, that it might be possible to be an adult all the time. I don't understand. Lenina's tone was firm. I know you don't, and that's why we went to bed together yesterday, like infants, instead of being adults in waiting. But it was fun, Lenina insisted. Wasn't it? Oh, the greatest fun, he answered, but in a voice so mournful, with an expression so profoundly miserable, that Lenina felt all her triumph suddenly evaporate. Perhaps he had found her too plump after all. I told you so, was all that Fanny said, when Lenina came and made her confidences. It's the alcohol they put in his surrogate. All the same, Lenina insisted, I do like him. He has such awfully nice hands, and the way he moves his shoulders, that's very attractive. She sighed, but I wish he weren't so odd. Halting for a moment outside the door of the director's room, Bernard drew a deep breath and squared his shoulders, bracing himself to meet the dislike and disapproval which he was certain of finding within. He knocked and entered. A permit for you to initial, Director, he said as airily as possible, and laid the paper on the writing table. The director glanced at him sourly, but the stamp of the World Controller's office was at the head of the paper, and the signature of Mustafa Mont, bold and black, crossed the bottom. Everything was perfectly in order. The director had no choice. He penciled his initials, 2 small pale letters ejected at the feet of Mustafa Mont, and was about to return the paper without a word of comment or genial Ford speech, when his eyes was caught by something written in the body of the permit. For the New Mexico Reservation, he said, and his tone, the face he lifted to Barnard, expressed a kind of agitated astonishment. Surprised by his surprise, Bernard nodded. There was a silence. The director leaned back in his chair, frowning. How long ago was it? He said, speaking more to himself than to Bernard. 20 years, I suppose. Near 25. I must have been your age, he sighed, and shook his head. Bernard felt extremely uncomfortable. A man so conventional, so scrupulously correct as the director, and to commit so gross a solecism. It made him want to hide his face, to run out of the room. Not that he himself saw anything intrinsically objectionable in people talking about the remote past. That was one of those hypnopedic prejudices he had, so he imagined, completely got rid of. What made him feel shy was the knowledge that the director disapproved, and yet had been betrayed into doing the forbidden thing. Under what inward compulsion? Through his discomfort, Bernard eagerly listened. I had the same idea as you, the director was saying. Wanted to have a look at the savages. Got a permit for New Mexico and went there for my summer holiday. With the girl I was having at the moment. She was a beta minus, I think. He shut his eyes. I think she had yellow hair. Anyhow, she was pneumatic, particularly pneumatic. I remember that. Well, we went there, and we looked at the savages, and we rode about on horses and all that. And then, it was almost the last day of my leave. Then, well, she got lost. We'd gone riding up on one of those revolting mountains, and it was horribly hot and oppressive. And after lunch, we went to sleep, or at least I did. She must have gone for a walk, alone. At any rate, when I woke up, she wasn't there, and the most frightful thunderstorm I've ever seen was just bursting on us, and it poured and roared and flashed, and the horses broke loose and ran away, and I fell down, trying to catch them, and hurt my knee, so that I could hardly walk. Still I searched, and I shouted and I searched, but there was no sign of her. Then I thought she must have gone back to the rest house by herself, so I crawled down into the valley by the way we had come. My knee was agonizingly painful, and I'd lost my soma. It took me hours. I didn't get back to the rest house till after midnight. And she wasn't there. She wasn't there. The director repeated. There was a silence. Well, he resumed at last, the next day there was a search, but we couldn't find her. She must have fallen into a gully somewhere, or been eaten by a mountain lion. Ford knows. Anyhow, it was horrible. It upsets me very much at the time, more than it ought to have done, I dare say, because, after all, it's the sort of accident that might have happened to anyone, and of course the social body persists, although the component cells may change. But this sleep-taught consolation did not seem to be very effective, shaking his head. I actually dream about it sometimes, the director went on in a low voice. Dream of being woken up by that peal of thunder, and finding her gone. Dream of searching and searching for her under the trees. He lapsed into the silence of reminiscence. You must have had a terrible shock, said Bernard, almost enviously. At the sound of his voice, the director stared into the guilty realization of where he was, shot a glance at Bernard, and averting his eyes, blushed darkly. Looked at him again with sudden suspicion and angrily on his dignity. Don't imagine, he said, that I had any indecorous relations with the girl. Nothing emotional, nothing long drawn. It was all perfectly healthy and normal. He handed Bernard the permit. I really don't know why I bored you with this trivial anecdote. Furious with himself for having given away a discreditable secret, he vented his rage on Bernard. The look in his eyes was now frankly malignant. And I should like to take this opportunity, Mr. Marks, he went on, of saying that I'm not at all pleased with the reports I receive of your behavior outside of working hours. You may say that this is not my business, but it is. I have the good name of the center to think of. My workers must be above suspicion, particularly those of the highest castes. Alphas are so conditioned that they do not have to be infantile in their emotional behavior, but it is all the more reason for them making a special effort to conform. It is their duty to be infantile, even against their inclination. And so, Mr. Marks, I give you fair warning. The director's voice vibrated with an indignation that had now become wholly righteous and impersonal. Was the expression of the disapproval of society itself. If I ever hear again of any lapse from a proper standard of infantile decorum, I shall ask for your transference to a sub-center, preferably to Iceland. Good morning. And swiveling round in his chair, he picked up his pen and began to write. That will teach him, he said to himself, but he was mistaken, for Bernard left the room with a swagger, exulting as he banged the door behind him. in the thought that he stood alone, and battled against the order of things, elated by the intoxicating consciousness of his individual significance and importance. Even the thought of persecution left him undismayed. Was rather tonic than depressing. He felt strong enough to meet and overcome affliction, strong enough to face even Iceland. And in this confidence was the greater for his this confidence was the greater for his not for a moment really believing that he would be called upon to face anything at all. People simply weren't transferred for things like that. Iceland was just a threat, a most stimulating and life-giving threat. Walking along the corridor, he actually whistled. Heroic was the account he gave that evening of his interview with the DHC, whereupon, it concluded, I simply told him to go to the bottomless past and marched out of the room. And that was that. He looked at Helmholtz Watson expectantly, awaiting his due reward of sympathy, encouragement, admiration, but no word came. Helmholtz sat silent, staring at the floor. He liked Bernard. He was grateful to him for being the only man of his acquaintance with whom he could talk about the subjects he felt to be important. Nevertheless, there were things in Bernard which he hated. This boasting, for example, and the outbursts of an abject self-pity with which it alternated, and his deplorable habit of being told after the event, and in full in absence of the most extraordinary presence of mind. He hated these things. Just because he liked Bernard. The second passed. Helmholtz continued to stare at the floor, and suddenly Bernard blushed and turned away. The journey was quite uneventful. The Blue Pacific rocket was 2.5 minutes early at New Orleans, lost 4 minutes in a tornado over Texas, but flew into a favorable air current at longitude 95 west, and was able to land at Santa Fe less than 40 seconds behind scheduled time. 40 seconds on a 6.5-hour flight. Not so bad, Lenina conceded. They slept that night at Santa Fe. The hotel was excellent, incomparably better, for example, than at horrible Aurora Bora Palace, in which Lenina had suffered so much the previous summer. Liquid air, television, vibro vacuum massage, radio, boiling caffeine solution, hot contraceptives, and 8 different kinds of scent were laid on in every bedroom. The synthetic music plant was working as they entered the hall and left nothing to be desired. A notice in the lift announced that there were 60 escalator squash racket courts in the hotel, and that obstacle and electromagnetic golf could both be played in the park. But it sounds simply too lovely, cried Lenina. I almost wish we could stay here. 60 escalator squash courts. There won't be any in the reservation, Bernard warned her, and no scent, no television, no hot water even. If you feel you can stand it, stay here till I come back. Lenina was quite offended. Of course I can stand it. I only said it was lovely here because progress is lovely, isn't it? 500 repetitions once a week from 13 to 17, Bernard said wearily, as though to himself. What did you say? I said that progress was lovely. That's why you mustn't come to the reservation unless you really want to. But I do want to. Very well then, said Bernard. And it was almost a threat. Their permit required the signature of the warden of the reservation, at whose office next morning they duly presented themselves. An Epsilon Plus Negro porter took in Bernard's card, and they were admitted almost immediately. The warden was a blonde and brachiocephalic alpha minus, short, red, moon-faced and broad-shouldered, with a loud, booming voice, very well adapted to the utterance of hypnopedic wisdom. He was a mine of irrelevant information and unasked for good advice. Once started, he went on and on, boomingly. 560,000 square kilometers, divided into 4 distinct sub-reservations, each surrounded by a high-tension wire fence. At this moment, and for no apparent reason, Bernard suddenly remembered that he had left the eau de cologne tap in his bathroom wide open and running. Supplied with current from the Grand Canyon hydroelectric station. Cost me a fortune by the time I get it back. With his mind's eye, Bernard saw the needle on the centimeter creeping round and round, ant-like, indefatigable. Quickly telephone to Helmholtz Watson. Upwards of 5,000 kilometers of fencing at 60,000 volts. You don't say so, said Lenina politely, not knowing in the least what the warden had said, but taking her cue from his dramatic pause. When the warden started booming, she had inconspicuously swallowed half a gram of soma, with the result that she could now sit, serenely not listening, thinking of nothing at all, but with her large blue eyes fixed on the warden's face in an expression of rapt attention. To touch the fence is instant death, pronounced the warden solemnly. There is no escape from a savage reservation. The word escape was suggestive. Perhaps, said Bernard, half rising, we ought to think of going. The little black needle was scurrying, an insect, nibbling through time, eating into his money. No escape, repeated the warden, waving him back into his chair. And as the permit was not yet countersigned, Bernard had no choice but to obey. Those who are born in the reservation, and remember, my dear young lady, he added, leering obscenely at Lenina, and speaking in an improper whisper, remember that, in the reservation, children still are born. Yes, actually born, revolting as that may seem. He hoped that this reference to a shameful subject would make Lenina blush, but she only smiled with stimulating intelligence and said, You don't say so. Disappointed, the warden began again. Those, I repeat, who are born in the reservation are destined to die there. Destined to die. A deciliter of eau de cologne every minute. 6 liters an hour, perhaps. Bernard tried again. We ought. Leaning forward, the warden tapped the table with his forefinger. You ask me how many people live in the reservation, and I reply, triumphantly, that we do not know. We can only guess. You don't say so. My dear young lady, I do say so. 6 times 24. No, it wouldn't be. It would be nearer 6 times 36. Bernard was pale and trembling with impatience, but inexorably that booming continued. About 60,000 Indians and half-breeds, absolute savages, or inspectors occasionally visit, otherwise no communication whatever with the civilized world, still preserve their repulsive habits and customs. Marriage, if you know what it is, my dear young lady, families, no conditioning, monstrous superstitions, Christianity and totemism and ancestor worship, extinct languages such as Zuni and Spanish and Athabascan, pumas, porcupines, and other ferocious animals, infectious diseases, priests, venomous lizards. You don't say so. They got away at last. Bernard dashed to the telephone. Quick, quick, but it took him nearly 3 minutes to get onto Helmholtz Watson. We might be among the savages already, he complained. Damned incompetence. Have a gram, suggested Lenina. He refused, preferring his anger, and at last, thank Ford, he was true, and yes, it was Helmholtz. Helmholtz, to whom he explained what had happened, and whom he promised to go round at once, and turn off the tap, yes, at once, but took this opportunity to tell him that the DHC had said, in public, yesterday evening, what? He's looking out for someone to take my place. Bernard's voice was agonized. So it's actually decided. Did he mention Iceland? You say he did? Ford, Iceland! He hung up the receiver and turned back to Lenina. His face was pale, his expression utterly dejected. What's the matter? She asked. The matter? He dropped heavily into a chair. I'm going to be sent to Iceland. Often in the past he had wondered what it would be like to be subjected, somaless and with nothing but his own inward resources to rely on, to some great trial, some pain, some persecution. He had even longed for affliction. As recently as a week ago, in the director's office, he had imagined himself courageously resisting, stoically accepting suffering without a word. The director's threats had actually elated him, made him feel larger than life. But that, as he now realized, was because he had not taken the threats quite seriously. He had not believed that, when it came to the point, the DHC would ever do anything. Now that it looked as though the threats were really to be fulfilled, Bernard was appalled. Of that imagined stoicism, that theoretical courage, not a trace was left. He raged against himself. What a fool! Against the director. How unfair not to give him that other chance. That other chance which he now had no doubt at all he had always intended to take. And Iceland. Iceland, Lenina shook her head. Was and will make me ill, she quoted. I take a gram, and only am. In the end, she persuaded him to swallow 4 tablets of soma. 5 minutes later, roots and fruits were abolished. The flowers of the present rosily blossomed. A message from the porter announced that, at the warden's orders, a reservation guard had come round with a plane and was waiting on the roof of the hotel. They went up at once. An octoroon in gamma green uniform saluted and proceeded to recite the morning's program. A bird's-eye view of 10 or a dozen of the principal pueblos, then a landing for lunch in the valley of Malface. The rest house was comfortable there, and up at Pueblo the savages would probably be celebrating their summer festival. It would be the best place to spend the night. They took their seats in the plane and set off. 10 minutes later they were crossing the frontier that separated civilization from savagery, uphill and down, across the desert of salt and sand, through forests and into the violet depths of canyons, over crag and peak and tabletop mesa. The fence marched on and on, irresistibly the straight line, the geometrical symbol of triumphant human purpose, and at its foot, here and there a mosaic of white bones, a still unrotted carcass dark on the tawny ground marked the place where deer or steer, puma or porcupine or coyote, or the greedy turkey buzzards, drawn down by the whiff of carrion and fulminated as though by a poetic justice, had come too close to the destroying wires. They never learn, said the green uniformed pilot, pointing down at the skeletons on the ground below them. And they never will learn, he added and laughed, as though he had somehow scored a personal triumph over the electrocuted animals. Bernard also laughed. After 2 grams of soma the joke seemed, for some reason, good. Laughed and then almost immediately dropped off to sleep. And sleeping was carried over, Taos and Tesique, over Nambe and Picorus and Poyoanque, over Sia and Cochiti, over Laguna and Acoma, and the enchanted mesa, over Zuni and Cibola and Oyo Saliente, and awoke at last to find the machine standing on the ground. Lenina carrying the suitcases into a small square house, and the gamma-green octoroon talking incomprehensively with a young Indian. Malface, explained the pilot, as Bernard stepped out. This is the rest house, and there's a dance this afternoon at the Pueblo. He'll take you there. He pointed to the sullen young savage. Funny, I expect, he grinned. Everything they do is funny. And with that he climbed into the plane and started up the engine. Back tomorrow, and remember, he added reassuringly to Lenina, they're perfectly tame. Savages won't do you any harm. They've got enough experience of gas bombs to know that they mustn't play any tricks. Still laughing, he threw the helicopter screws into gear, accelerated, and was gone. Okay, I think this is a very good point to end things off. We will be heading into the native reservation next. The savage reservation, I mean. Yeah, I think the story is really good thus far. Um, I must say that Aldous Huxley does have an interesting writing style where he tends to repeat words a lot, but then I guess the hypnopedaic tutoring and teachings also is repetition, so it might be a theme he's trying to hold, or it's just his writing style. But I haven't read any other works of him. Um, Other than that, yeah, the story is also kind of interesting with Bernard being like a regular human being like you and me, and Lenina is basically just constantly parroting the hypnopedaic teachings. Um, yeah, I don't know when I'll be streaming next, as usual. Uh, will thank all 0 of you for joining in live. If you do not listen to this live and you made it till the end, good on you. I hope to see you next time. If you have any comments or suggestions, feel free to post them. Or if you want to write adorations of my speaking voice, that's also quite allowed. Other than that, I do hope to see you guys in the next live stream. Have a nice whatever day it is you're listening on this to. Fuck, my brain's going dead. I will see you guys later. Bye bye.